Once again, my name is Graham Standish. I am the Executive Director of Samaritan Counseling, Guidance, and Consulting, where I also am the Director of our Caring for Clergy and Congregations program. And I feel so blessed to be able to come and talk with you through this effort that we're having with the Synod of the Trinity, and that really comes out of the staff at the Synod of the Trinity, of their deep care for you as a congregation, and also for pastors. And I feel tremendously blessed to be able to be part of this and sharing with you. As you probably and hopefully already know, we've already done 2 videos. Part 1, which was on reducing the load the pastors have. Part 2 was on how to value the pastor. And today, I want to talk to you about something that's a little bit more difficult as a congregation, but I want to put this as a mantle on your shoulders to help pastors and to help churches, which is, how do you, as elders and board members and members of a church, create a better situation for ministry? Because whether you know it or not only in the Presbyterian Church USA, but in all of the mainline church, whether we're talking about Lutherans or Episcopalians or Methodists or Disciples of Christ or United Church of Christ, or all the different denominations that have split off, we're all in the same boat. We are facing a dire situation. Our churches are declining. They have been since the 1960s. But the pandemic has actually accelerated that decline. There are church research groups that are estimating that through the pandemic, most churches have lost 30% of their members, and another 30% may be on the fence. Especially those who've been tuning in digitally. There's a dilemma there. If you take away the digital ministry, the YouTubed or Facebooked or recorded or streamed live services, they're actually never going to come back. But they're sort of on the fence there, where they kind of want to come back in person, but they kind of don't. So we really are looking at a situation where only about 40% of our members coming through the pandemic are committed to actually being there for worship. Another 40% are kind of at home and in person, and another 30% have just left. Either they've gone to another church or another denomination, but many more have just walked away because they're not sure about going back to church and what the value church has for them. Our churches are declining. And we've got even more problems because fewer members of our churches are going to seminary and feel called to become pastors. And that's coupled with many pastors who are just walking away from ministry right now. We're in a dire situation. And unfortunately, what most churches are doing, especially when they're in between pastors, is, well, if we can find the right pastor, we can actually turn around the situation. If we can just get that one young pastor who can reach out and get young families and young people, etc. Well, people have been trying to do that the whole time I've been a pastor, and we're still declining. The reality is, pastoral ministry is a really tough vocation to enter in right now. We are in a period where all sorts of careers, whether it's in digital or in healthcare or in all these other areas, are growing and expanding. And we're contracting. You know, one of the reasons why, and I'm just going to be blunt, one of the reasons why we're declining and it's been so difficult to attract people to go to seminary to then become pastors, a large part of the situation we're facing is that our churches right now have not been great places to serve. It's just a fact. Pastors come in with creative ideas to move, and members go, well, we don't want to do that. We want to go back to the way it was. You know, back in my day, people used to sit in the pews, the kids would sit in the pews, and they wouldn't make noise. Or back in my day, people came to church. We didn't have to have all this digital stuff. Well, here's the problem. We're not in that day. We are in a different day. And just as, you know, we now have computers and smartphones and smartwatches and smart cars, we need to actually create churches that are smart churches. But it's not happening. I think about two pastors that I'm working with, and neither one is Presbyterian Church USA, and I'm going to change other details. But I think about one pastor I work with, and her name is Tina. She is a pastor who was encouraged to go to, what was called to go to a church in a completely different part of the country after she had spent 25 years in one particular church and just helped it grow tremendously. She originally took over a church of a very small church that was a new church plant that was really on the knife's edge of dying or going. And she came in and not only stabilized that church, but over the course of her time there, she helped triple the church's membership. There was a church in a big city in another part of the country that really pursued her, and she did go there. And they had said, oh yeah, we are positioned to grow. We are positioned to blah, 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 blah. Well, what they hadn't told her was there was extreme conflict among the staff. And there was conflict even on the board because some just wanted to go back to the way it was and others wanted to go forward. Well, the ones who wanted to go forward were on the search committee. And so she has been in that church for 3 years. I have now seen her take 2 medical leaves of absence. She has now not only seeing me as a clergy coach, but also sees a spiritual director and also has been seeing a doctor on a regular basis because her health is declining. What changed? I mean, this is a fabulous pastor. I mean, she's incredibly talented, actually known across the country in her denomination. Well, the problem was she went to a church that tolerates dysfunction, that tolerates conflict, that actually when things don't go well blamed her for it instead of looking inward and saying, are we making this a good situation for a pastor? Or I think of another pastor that I'm working with. His name is John, and he's in a little bit more of a rural congregation, who was telling me about how he kind of struggles because they're just apathetic. They won't do anything. But about also how he had gotten this 2-page blistering letter from one of the elders that just ripped apart every part of his ministry. And he's like, why should I stay here? All they want to do is argue about digital and masks and everything else. The conflict in our churches is getting worse. Now, I've not been immune to this. I do remember a number of Easters ago, I did a sermon I thought was pretty creative. I got an anonymous letter the week afterwards saying, your sermon ruined Easter for me and my whole family. I have no idea what to do with that. What am I supposed to do? I mean, I guess I'm supposed to change my Easter sermon, but I'll tell you, you do 22 years of doing Easter sermons and try to come up with something new each time. I came up with something that I thought was creative. A lot of people afterwards came up to me and said they loved it, but this anonymous letter said, I ruined Easter for everybody. Yeah, it doesn't help. It doesn't help a pastor move forward. And the conflict in our churches is just getting worse. Now, we can blame the pandemic, but quite frankly, I think there's something more there. I think there is a level of polarization going on in our churches right now that mirrors the country. We've had polarization in almost my whole 33 years of being a pastor, but it's even worse. We've gotten to the point where Jesus is on the side of vaccines. Jesus is on the side of masks. No, if Jesus was here, Jesus would tell us to get rid of masks and don't worry about being vaccinated. You know what? Neither side is listening to what Jesus is saying. They're just getting into the political polarization of our culture and bringing it in onto ourselves. We are paying more attention now to politics than we are to the gospel. And we put our pastors in the middle. You must preach my politics for me to love you as a pastor. So if the pastor does a sermon that is on one side of the aisle, the other side is going to be angry, maybe walk out, maybe leave the church. And vice versa. If a pastor preaches this way, the other half is going to leave. The result of this is that many pastors now not only don't want to pastor anymore, But they're not only walking away from the church. I know several who now have walked away from the Christian faith. Doesn't mean they don't believe in God. Doesn't mean they're becoming Buddhists. I talked to one 3 weeks ago who said, I spent 13 years in a church. I still love God. I still love Jesus. But I'm not sure I want to be part of a religion where everybody eats their own. Now, what I'm doing is blunt, and it sounds dire. But the question is, what can you do about that? Because you can do something to improve your pastor's leadership by simply being a voice that helps improve the situation of your church. Because if we're willing to create a better situation in our churches, we can create healthier ministries. So what do? I'm going to tell you one thing that maybe would be the best, and I'm going to put this on everybody who's watching this. Turn off talk radio, turn off social media, turn off especially cable news that's on this side or that side, because that's infecting your soul. Because Christians do not follow the culture. Christians follow the gospel, and the gospel is not following what the prophets on cable news and on the radio and in social media want. Those people want to make a profit off their prophecies. They are people who make millions and millions of dollars by getting you riled up and getting you angry. And they don't really care about what the division it creates. So be somebody who's going to pay more attention to the gospel. And let me tell you where I really have a model for this. I read a book a couple years ago called The Patient Ferment of the Early Church by Alan Kreider. He's a Mennonite church historian. And he said, in the early church, they didn't have the Apostles' Creed really for the first 200 and something years. We recite the Apostles' Creed. He said, actually, in the early church, they didn't have an Apostles' Creed to recite, and they didn't recite the Apostles' Creed, so they didn't have to memorize what we believe together. But if you were going to be a Christian in that early church, you did have to memorize and periodically recite, wait for it, the Sermon on the Mount. Now, I want you to think about that. How different would Christianity be if, instead of memorizing and reciting the Apostles' Creed, we memorized and recited the Sermon on the Mount? The difference in this early church that grew in the midst of this oppressive Roman Empire, it grew because people memorized something that was telling them how to live together and how to live with others. Things like turn the other cheek. Blessed are the poor and the poor in spirit. Blessed are the meek. Blessed are those who mourn. Ask, knock, and seek. Golden rule. Do unto others as you would have them do unto yourself. Be a leadership group in your church that stops asking how I can get the pastor or how can I get these people to do what I want. And instead be part of a process that asks the questions, how do we come together to seek what God wants? Now, if you need help for that, I'll do a shameless plug for one of my books. It has been a bestseller for now 16 years. It's called Becoming a Blessed Church. And it's all about how to become a church that is rooted in and grounded in discernment and prayer and love and compassion and coming together. But whether you get the book or not, doesn't really matter. But what I will encourage you to do is to now have a discussion on these two questions. To what extent have you or your church allowed the country's polarizations to become your polarizations within the church? To what extent have we let the country's polarizations become our polarizations? And number two, what can we concretely do to make our church a better situation? My blessings on you as you discuss, and I really hope that over the course of not only this video, but the previous two, that you have found a way and are finding a way to make not only your situation better, but to help your pastor become better so that your congregation can become better and healthier. And thank you so much, and amen.